how do we fund a trust? Like, what's involved in funding a trust?
Welcome to Barry's Bites. Please join our host, attorney and financial advisor Chris Barry.
And so first, think of a trust kind of like a piggy bank. Right now, it's just an empty piggy bank. We actually have to put things into the piggy bank for it to be effective. Similarly with a trust, if we set up a trust by itself, it's like an empty piggy bank. It's just sitting there. There's nothing actually in the trust. And so there's really two ways that we can get assets into the trust, because that's creating your rule book. That's creating a set of rules that everyone has to follow, that your trustee has to follow. That directs where your assets are going to go upon death. That's how you avoid probate, is by creating that trust and funding it. And so there's two ways that assets can get into the piggy bank. One is we can have the trust as the owner of the asset. So this would be changing ownership of a brokerage account to name the trust as the owner, changing ownership of your home, doing a deed where now the trust is the owner. That's typically how we set up the asset protection trust, the castle trust that we do, is we'll name the trust as the owner, because that's what builds in all of the protection. We want the trust as the owner. And with different types of accounts, we handle that differently. With a brokerage account, we would then title that brokerage account in the trust. If it's real estate, we would deed that property to the trust. If it's a business like an LLC, we assign that business to the trust. So now it's in the piggy bank, and that builds in the asset protection if it's a castle trust, and starts that clock for nursing home or Medicaid spend down, where if we make it 5 years, 100% of what we put into that piggy bank is protected from that nursing home or Medicaid spend down. When we're setting up asset protection trusts like a castle trust, we want as much as possible owned by the trust. Like cash value life insurance is another thing that a lot of times we'll throw into the trust. So one way is we can have the trust as the owner. The other way the assets get into the trust is we list the trust as a beneficiary, meaning the trust is not the owner. We don't have to change title per se, but we have to change a beneficiary designation on your IRAs, on your 401ks. We have to change the beneficiary to now list the trust as a beneficiary. And here's something that a lot of people forget about, is that your like general checking and savings accounts at the bank, that should list the trust as a beneficiary. So you might be married and you might have a joint with your spouse. If one of you passes away, it goes to the survivor. That's fine. That avoids probate. But what happens if both of you pass away in a car accident? That's where we need to have a transfer on death or payable on death designation, naming the trust as a beneficiary. Too often when people come in and they sit down with one of us, and maybe they already have a trust, but we review the funding of the trust, a lot of times they miss the checking or savings account, or they forget about the house or the real estate. A lot of times we'll do what's called a ladybird deed, a type of deed that says the home is in your name while you're alive, but upon death, it goes into the trust. So it's a beneficiary designation to the trust. So when we set up a revocable living trust, a trust that avoids probate, controls the distribution, typically we'll name the trust as a beneficiary of everything. If we're setting up an asset protection trust like a castle trust, we want the trust the owner of as much as possible. It's a distinction between the two types of trusts and how we get the trust funded. How do we title assets, make sure everything is pointing to the trust? Because that's the key. At the end of the day, we want everything one way or another pointing to the trust. Every single asset, other than say vehicles. With vehicles, there's a simple procedure upon death where next of kin can walk in with a death certificate. The Secretary of State will transfer it to next of kin. But basically everything else, anything else that really has title, we want it titled pointing to the trust. And if it's an asset protection trust, typically we want the trust as the owner. If it's a revocable living trust, typically we want the trust as a beneficiary. And then we need to make a distinction between two types of accounts. We need to talk about qualified accounts and non-qualified accounts. Qualified accounts are something that has a tax qualification. So a 401k, an IRA, a Roth IRA, a Roth 401k, a 457, a 403b, all of these have some type of tax qualification. Then we have non-qualified accounts, just maybe a joint investment account or even a checking account, savings account. Those are non-qualified. And the reason we need to make a distinction is because the way that we title things, like who the primary beneficiary is, it depends on what type of account it is. So if it's a qualified account, like a 401k or IRA, if you're married, we would name spouse first and then trust, because the spouse can do what's called a spousal rollover, where typically there's a tax advantage to doing that, where now that qualified account basically becomes a surviving spouse. But then the contingent beneficiary would be the trust. We would name the trust as a contingent beneficiary. So when that surviving spouse passes away, then it flows into the trust and can go to the beneficiaries. If it's a non-qualified account, then typically we'll just name the trust as the primary beneficiary.